Cut the grass better, gardener. The words echoed across the manicured lawn as Brandon Whitmore's laughter drifted down from his marble balcony. I turned off the mower and wiped sweat from my forehead, looking up at his smirking face. 3 years of this treatment, and today I had finally reached my limit. "You are fired," he yelled, his voice dripping with the same entitled cruelty I had witnessed countless times before. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and dialed Harold Pembroke, the estate lawyer. "Trigger the inheritance clause," I said loud enough for Brandon to hear every single word. Within seconds, his phone rang. He looked down at me, his face suddenly drained of all color, eyes wide with terror. "What did you do?" Standing in that perfectly manicured garden, watching Brandon's face transform from smugness to pure panic, I felt a surge of satisfaction I had been waiting 3 long years to experience. He had no idea what was coming, but I had been preparing for this exact moment since the day I first walked through the gates of the Whitmore estate. It all started when I was 29, drowning in student loan debt and working 3 part-time jobs just to keep my tiny apartment. Fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science, I had dreams of making a difference in the world, but reality hit hard when I discovered that passion does not pay the bills. I was scrolling through job listings late one night when I stumbled across an advertisement that seemed almost too good to be true. Estate maintenance position available, housing provided, generous compensation. Must be willing to maintain confidentiality regarding employment details. Serious inquiries only. The phone number led me to Harold Pembroke, a distinguished lawyer in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. He explained that the position involved maintaining the grounds of a private estate, living in the guest quarters, and most importantly, keeping the true nature of my employment completely secret. I thought the secrecy requirement was odd, but the salary he offered was more than my 3 jobs combined plus free housing. When I met Charles Whitmore for the first time, I understood why discretion was so important. Charles was 81 years old with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul. He walked with a cane but moved with purpose, and when he spoke, every word carried weight. During our first private conversation, he told me something that changed everything. "I am not just hiring a gardener, Vicki. I am looking for someone I can trust with something much more important than lawn care." Over the following weeks, Charles began sharing his real concerns. His son, Brandon, whom he had adopted as a teenager after marrying his second wife, had grown into exactly the kind of person Charles despised. Brandon had never worked a real day in his life, treated staff like servants, and showed no respect for the family legacy Charles had spent decades building. Charles revealed that he had been secretly documenting Brandon's behavior for years through hidden cameras throughout the estate. He showed me footage of Brandon screaming at housekeepers, making cruel jokes about the lawn crew, and boasting to friends about how he would fire people for entertainment once he inherited everything. But the most shocking revelation came during my 6th month at the estate, when Charles asked me to meet him in his private study. The room was lined with law books and family photographs, and Charles sat behind a massive oak desk with a stack of legal documents spread before him. "Vicki, I need to tell you something that will sound unbelievable, but I have had my lawyers verify every detail. If Brandon ever fires the estate caretaker without just cause witnessed by legal counsel, my entire inheritance will transfer to that caretaker immediately." I stared at him in disbelief. Charles explained that he had spent months working with his legal team to create an ironclad clause that would protect his legacy from Brandon's destructive tendencies. The caretaker position was specifically designed as a test of Brandon's character, and I was the designated trigger person. "But why me?" I asked, still struggling to process what he was telling me. Charles smiled, and for the first time since I had known him, his eyes filled with tears. "Because, my dear, you have already proven yourself to be everything Brandon is not. You are kind, hardworking, and You treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position. I have been watching you care for injured birds in the garden, help Maria with her English lessons, and stay late to make sure everything is perfect. You have the character I always hoped Brandon would develop. As the months passed, Charles and I grew close. He became like the grandfather I had never had, teaching me about business investing and what it meant to build something lasting. He shared stories about his late wife, his regrets about Brandon's upbringing, and his dreams for what the estate could become under the right leadership. When Charles died suddenly of a heart attack 6 months ago, I thought my life would return to uncertainty. But Harold delivered Charles's final message to me during the reading of his will. When the time comes, you will know what to do. Trust your instincts and remember that true character is revealed when people think no one is watching. Now, standing in the garden with Brandon's panicked voice echoing from his balcony, I finally understood what Charles had been preparing me for. Brandon had just sealed his own fate through the same arrogance and cruelty that Charles had been documenting for years. Harold's voice came through my phone calm and professional. The inheritance clause has been activated, Vicki. As of this moment, you are the legal owner of the Whitmore estate and all associated assets. Brandon was racing down the stairs from his balcony, his phone still pressed to his ear, his face a mask of confusion and growing terror. He had spent his entire adult life believing that wealth and privilege made him untouchable. Today, he was about to learn how wrong he had been. Brandon burst through the French doors leading from the mansion to the garden, his expensive Italian loafers clicking frantically against the stone patio. His phone was pressed so tightly to his ear that his knuckles had turned white, and I could hear the urgent voice of his lawyer even from 20 feet away. "What do you mean the clause is legitimate?" Brandon shouted into the phone. "There has to be something you can do." I calmly walked over to the garden shed and began putting away my tools, watching as Brandon's perfectly constructed world started to crumble around him. He had always believed that being Charles's heir made him invincible, but he was about to discover just how carefully Charles had planned for this exact scenario. The conversation with his lawyer grew more heated as Brandon paced back and forth across the patio. From what I could hear, his legal team was confirming what Harold had already told me. The inheritance clause was not only legitimate, but had been reviewed and approved by multiple law firms to ensure it would hold up under any legal challenge. Brandon's face grew paler with each passing minute as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He had been bleeding money for the past 2 years through gambling debts, failed business ventures, and an extravagant lifestyle that he had funded by borrowing against his expected inheritance. Without access to the Whitmore fortune, those debts would become a serious problem very quickly. His phone rang again, and I watched his expression change from panic to pure dread. It was Miranda, his fiancée, calling from an upscale boutique in downtown where she had been shopping for their upcoming engagement party. "What do you mean the card was declined?" Miranda's voice was loud enough for me to hear clearly. "I am trying to buy my dress, and they are saying there is a problem with the account." Brandon tried to explain the situation without revealing the full extent of what had just happened, but Miranda was not someone who accepted excuses easily. She had grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and any disruption to her shopping routine was treated as a personal crisis. "Just use the other card," she demanded, "or call the bank and fix whatever technical problem they are having." "There is no technical problem," Brandon finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The accounts have been frozen. Everything has been frozen." The silence that followed was deafening. Even from my position by the garden shed, I could sense Miranda processing this information and calculating what it meant for her future. She had not fallen in love with Brandon's personality or character. She had fallen in love with the Whitmore fortune, and now that fortune was no longer his to offer. "I will call you back," Miranda said coldly before hanging up. Brandon stood frozen for a moment, staring at his phone, as if it might somehow change the reality of his situation. Then he spun around and marched toward me, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "You cannot do this," he said, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. "Whatever game you think you are playing, it ends right now." I set down my pruning shears and looked him directly in the eyes. This is not a game, Brandon. This is justice. Justice, he scoffed. You are a gardener. You have no right to this estate, no connection to this family. My father was obviously not in his right mind when he created this ridiculous clause. Your father was perfectly lucid, I replied calmly. He spent years documenting your behavior and planning for this exact moment. He knew that eventually your true character would reveal itself. Brandon's laugh was bitter and desperate. Character. What would you know about character? You cut grass for a living. I smiled, remembering Charles's prediction that Brandon would reveal his prejudices when faced with consequences for his actions. You are right about one thing. I do know what it means to work for a living. I know what it means to treat people with respect regardless of their position, and I know what it means to earn something through character rather than expect it through birthright. Brandon pulled out his phone again and began frantically dialing numbers. He called his personal banker, his investment advisor, and several wealthy friends who had always been happy to lend him money when he had collateral to offer. One by one, they all delivered the same message. Without the Whitmore inheritance, Brandon was no longer a good investment. His country club membership had already been suspended pending payment of outstanding fees. His lease on the downtown penthouse apartment would be terminated within 30 days unless he could provide proof of income. The exento cars in his garage were all leased through the estate's business accounts, which were now under my control. As the sun began to set over the perfectly manicured grounds, Brandon sank into one of the wrought iron chairs on the patio and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly powerless, and he had no idea how to handle that reality. The sound of tires on gravel announced Miranda's arrival. She had left her shopping expedition early and driven straight to the estate in her bright red convertible. Brandon looked up hopefully, perhaps thinking that his fiancée would offer him the emotional support he desperately needed. He was about to be disappointed once again. Miranda walked across the garden in her designer heels, her expression unreadable. She was a striking woman in her late 20s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of polished appearance that comes from unlimited access to high-end salons and boutiques. Brandon stood up to greet her, relief visible on his face as he prepared to explain the situation and ask for her understanding. Instead of embracing him, Miranda stopped 3 feet away and crossed her arms. "We need to talk," she said coldly. Brandon began explaining what had happened, describing me as a manipulative gardener who had somehow tricked his father into changing his will. But as he spoke, I noticed Miranda glancing in my direction with an expression that seemed less surprised than it should have been. That was when I realized it was time to reveal the complete truth, not just about the inheritance clause, but about who I really was and why Charles had chosen me for this role. "Brandon," I interrupted, causing both of them to turn and look at me. "There is something else you need to know. Something Charles wanted you to understand about why this happened." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath and began sharing the story that Charles had made me promise to tell only after the inheritance clause had been triggered. 32 years ago, Charles had a daughter named Elizabeth. She was his pride and joy, a kind and intelligent young woman who worked as a teacher and volunteered at local charities. When Elizabeth was 25, she died in a car accident, and Charles thought he had lost his only biological child forever. What Elizabeth left behind was a baby daughter who was placed for adoption. Charles spent the next 3 decades trying to find that little girl, hiring private investigators and checking adoption records whenever possible. He never gave up hope that someday he would be reunited with his granddaughter. Brandon was staring at me with growing confusion. "What does any of this have to do with you?" "I am that granddaughter," I said quietly. "Charles found me when I responded to his job posting. He recognized me immediately because I have Elizabeth's smile and my grandmother's eyes. DNA testing confirmed what he already knew in his heart." The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Miranda remained perfectly still, though I noticed she was no longer looking surprised by these revelations. Charles spent my first year at the estate getting to know me, I continued. He watched me care for injured animals, help the other staff members, and treat everyone with respect, regardless of their position. He saw the character traits he had hoped you would develop, but that you had never shown. During that same year, Charles documented your behavior through hidden cameras throughout the estate. He recorded you screaming at housekeepers for minor mistakes, making racist comments about the landscaping crew, and then bragging to friends about how you would fire people for entertainment once you inherited everything. Brandon finally found his voice. "You are lying. My father would never spy on me." I pulled out my phone and accessed the secure app that Harold had given me. Charles had left specific instructions about when and how to share this evidence. The screen filled with video footage of Brandon from just 2 weeks ago, berating Maria, the head housekeeper, for not polishing the silver fast enough. "You are pathetic." Brandon's voice came through the phone speaker. "Do you understand how easily replaceable you are? I could fire you right now and have 10 people begging for your job by tomorrow." The video continued showing Brandon throwing a crystal vase against the wall because he did not like how Maria had arranged the flowers, then laughing when she had to clean up the broken glass while trying not to cry. Charles designed the inheritance clause specifically to give his real family the legacy while teaching you a final lesson, I said, putting my phone away. He hoped that someday you might learn from this experience and become the person he always wanted you to be. Brandon was shaking his head frantically. "This cannot be happening. You cannot just show up and steal everything my family built." "Charles built this estate, not you," I replied, "and now he has left it to someone who will use it to honor his memory instead of destroying it for personal gain." That was when Miranda finally spoke up, her voice calm and controlled. "She is right, Brandon, and there is something else you need to know." Brandon turned to her, hopefully perhaps, thinking his fiancée was about to take his side in this impossible situation. Instead, Miranda reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. "Charles asked me to document your behavior," she said matter-of-factly. "I have been recording our conversations for the past year." Brandon stared at her in shock. "What are you talking about?" Miranda pressed a button on the device, and Brandon's voice filled the garden air. "You should see how terrified the staff gets when I threaten to fire them. It is hilarious how desperate people become when their jobs are at risk. Once I inherit everything, I am going to fire all the longtime employees just to watch them beg." The recording continued with Brandon describing his plans to sell family heirlooms, to fund his gambling habits, and his intention to convert the estate into a party venue for his wealthy friends. Miranda looked directly at Brandon as his recorded voice continued revealing his cruel intentions. "Charles approached me after he witnessed you humiliate a server at that restaurant downtown. He offered to pay me to gather evidence of your real character, and I agreed." Brandon's face had gone completely white. "You have been lying to me this entire time," Miranda shrugged. "Just like you have been lying to everyone about what kind of person you really are." She walked over and handed me the recording device. "Charles wanted to make sure you had all the evidence you needed to defend the inheritance clause against any legal challenges." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Brandon sank back into his chair, finally understanding that everyone in his life had been working together to expose his true character. His fiancée had never loved him. His father had been planning his downfall for years. And the gardener he had treated with such contempt was actually the rightful heir to everything he had expected to inherit. For the first time in his privileged life, Brandon was completely alone and powerless, and this was only the beginning of his problems. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that turned Brandon's situation from bad to catastrophic. I watched from the kitchen window as he paced frantically around the patio, his phone pressed to his ear, calling every wealthy friend and business connection he had cultivated over the years. His first call was to Preston Matthews, his former roommate from prep school who had inherited a chain of luxury hotels. Brandon explained his situation and asked for a temporary loan to cover his immediate expenses while he figured out how to challenge the inheritance clause. Preston's response was swift and brutal. Sorry, man, but I cannot risk my reputation by associating with someone who is about to be financially ruined. Call me when you get back on your feet. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Brandon's next call was to the members of his private poker group, wealthy men, who had been happy to take his money during their weekly games. He offered to sell them some of his personal possessions to cover his gambling debts, but they were no longer interested in dealing with him once they learned he had no access to family money. One by one, Brandon's so-called friends distanced themselves from his crisis. They had enjoyed his company when he was buying expensive dinners and funding lavish parties, but none of them were willing to help him now that he needed genuine support. Miranda arrived around noon, but not to offer comfort. She was there to collect her belongings and make it clear that their engagement was officially over. I watched through the French doors as she walked through the mansion gathering the jewelry and designer clothes that Brandon had bought for her over the past year. She moved efficiently and emotionally detached, like someone completing a business transaction rather than ending a relationship. When Brandon tried to convince her to stay and work through their problems together, Miranda's response was devastating in its honesty. Brandon, our entire relationship was based on your family's money. Without that, we have nothing in common and no future together. She paused in the doorway and looked back at him with something that might have been pity. For what it is worth, I hope this experience teaches you something about how the other half lives. Maybe being poor will make you a better person. After Miranda left, Brandon called his lawyer again, demanding that Thomas Garrett file emergency motions to freeze the estate transfer and challenge Charles's mental competency at the time the inheritance clause was written. But when Brandon mentioned that he could not afford Garrett's retainer fees, the lawyer's enthusiasm for the case diminished significantly. High-profile attorneys like Thomas Garrett did not work for free, especially on cases that would be difficult to win. By evening, Brandon was sitting alone on the patio, staring at his phone as if it might somehow provide a solution to his impossible situation. That was when Harold arrived with additional news that would make Brandon's circumstances even worse. Harold walked across the garden carrying a leather briefcase, his expression serious but not unkind. He had always treated Brandon with professional courtesy, even while working with Charles to document his misconduct. Brandon, Harold said, setting his briefcase on the patio table, "We need to discuss some additional matters that have come to light since the inheritance clause was activated." "What additional matters?" Brandon asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Harold opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of financial documents. "While Charles was documenting your behavior, he also discovered some irregularities in the estate's household accounts. It appears that you have been withdrawing money without authorization and selling family antiques to cover your personal expenses." Brandon's face flushed red. "I am his son. I had every right to use that money." "Actually," Harold said calmly, "you did not. The household accounts were specifically designated for estate maintenance and staff salaries. By using them for gambling and personal expenses, you committed embezzlement. Charles documented every unauthorized transaction for the past 2 years." Harold spread the documents across the table, showing bank statements and receipts that painted a clear picture of Brandon's financial misconduct. The total amount was over $200,000. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Harold reached back into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder marked with an official seal from the district attorney's office. "Charles filed a complaint with law enforcement 6 months before he died," Harold explained. "He provided them with evidence of your embezzlement and your threats against staff members. They have been building a criminal case and waiting for the appropriate time to file charges." Brandon stared at the folder in horror. "Criminal charges. The district attorney's office will formally file charges tomorrow morning. You are looking at potential prison time for embezzlement, elder abuse, and intimidation of witnesses." As if his situation could not get any worse, Brandon's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but had hoped never to hear from again. It was Tommy Delacroix, a man who ran underground poker games and was not known for his patience with customers who failed to pay their debts. Brandon answered the phone with trembling hands. "Brandon, my friend." Tommy's voice was deceptively cheerful. "I heard some interesting news today about your family situation. Something about you losing your inheritance. How did you hear about that? Brandon asked, though he already suspected that news of his downfall was spreading quickly through certain circles. Word travels fast when someone owes me $300,000, Tommy replied. I was willing to be patient because I knew you were good for the money. But if you no longer have access to family funds, then we have a problem. Brandon's throat felt like sandpaper. I just need some time to figure this out. Tommy's laugh was cold and humorless. Time is a luxury you can no longer afford. You have 48 hours to pay what you owe, or my associates will need to have a conversation with you about alternative payment methods. The line went dead, leaving Brandon staring at his phone in terror. Tommy Delacroix was not someone who made idle threats, and Brandon knew that his gambling debts had just become a matter of personal safety. As darkness fell over the estate, Brandon realized that he had lost everything in a single day. His money, his fiancée, his friends, his freedom, and now possibly his physical safety. The arrogance and cruelty that had defined his character for so many years had finally caught up with him, and his problems were about to get much worse. Despite his desperate circumstances, Brandon was not ready to surrender. The next morning, he pawned his expensive watch and used the money to hire a new lawyer, David Chen, who specialized in contesting wills and had a reputation for taking on difficult cases for desperate clients. David reviewed the inheritance clause and the evidence Harold had provided, then assured Brandon that there were grounds to challenge Charles's mental capacity at the time the clause was written. No reasonable person would disinherit their own son in favor of a gardener, David argued, which suggested that Charles had been suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairment. Brandon felt hopeful for the first time in days as David filed emergency motions to freeze the estate transfer and demand psychiatric evaluations of Charles's mental state during his final years. The strategy seemed logical, proved that Charles had not been mentally competent and the inheritance clause would be invalidated. But Harold had anticipated this exact legal challenge, and Charles had prepared for it years in advance. 3 days later, Harold arrived at the courthouse with evidence that destroyed Brandon's case before it could even begin. He brought security footage from throughout the estate that showed Charles conducting complex business negotiations, reviewing financial statements, and discussing legal strategies with multiple attorneys right up until the week of his death. The footage also revealed the extent of Brandon's misconduct in devastating detail. There were videos of Brandon stealing cash from the household safe, selling antique furniture to private collectors, and threatening staff members who questioned his authority. The recordings captured years of behavior that proved Brandon had been systematically abusing his position and exploiting his father's trust. But the most damaging evidence came from Charles himself. Harold played video messages that Charles had recorded specifically for this legal challenge, in which he explained his reasoning for the inheritance clause with perfect clarity and mental acuity. My son Brandon has shown himself to be cruel, dishonest, and completely lacking in the character necessary to preserve our family legacy, Charles said in the recording. I am of sound mind and body as I make this decision, and I am confident that history will prove me correct. The videos were accompanied by medical records from Charles's personal physician, who confirmed that Charles had shown no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. Psychological evaluations conducted during the year before his death showed that Charles had been mentally sharp and fully aware of the consequences of his decisions. David tried to argue that the inheritance clause was the product of undue influence, suggesting that I had manipulated Charles into disinheriting Brandon. But Harold countered with employment records showing that Charles had designed the clause before he ever hired me, and that the job posting itself had been created specifically to find someone who could serve as the designated caretaker. The judge reviewed all the evidence and dismissed Brandon's challenge within a week. The inheritance clause was legally sound, Charles had been mentally competent, and there was no evidence of fraud or undue influence. Brandon left the courthouse in a daze, realizing that his legal options had been exhausted, but his troubles were just beginning. That afternoon, two police detectives arrived at the estate to arrest Brandon on charges of embezzlement and elder abuse. The district attorney's office had decided that Charles's death was the appropriate time to move forward with prosecution, and they had enough evidence to ensure conviction. I watched from the garden as Brandon was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with shock. The local news crews had somehow learned about the arrest, and cameras captured every moment of his humiliation as he was placed in the back of a police car. The story broke on the evening news with the headline, "Wealthy Heir Arrested for Stealing from Dying Father." The news report included some of the security footage that Harold had provided to prosecutors, showing Brandon's cruel treatment of staff members and his theft of family assets. Within hours, the story had spread to social media, where videos of Brandon's behavior went viral. People were outraged by the footage of him screaming at elderly housekeepers and making racist comments about the landscaping crew. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Brandon's former friends rushed to distance themselves from the scandal, giving interviews in which they claimed to have always suspected that something was wrong with his behavior. Miranda appeared on a local talk show describing how she had been secretly working with Charles to expose Brandon's true character. The wealthy social circles that had once welcomed Brandon now treated him like a pariah. His country club membership was permanently revoked, his name was removed from charity event guest lists, and several business associates publicly condemned his actions. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the attention his case attracted from other victims of his cruelty. Former staff members came forward with their own stories of abuse and humiliation, and their testimonies painted a picture of systematic misconduct that went back years. Maria, the head housekeeper, gave an emotional interview describing how Brandon had threatened to have her deported if she ever complained about his treatment. James, the former groundskeeper, revealed that Brandon had fired him after he refused to lie about a minor accident to help Brandon avoid insurance consequences. One by one, the people Brandon had hurt and humiliated shared their experiences, and each story made the public more angry about his abuse of power and privilege. As I watched the news coverage from the comfort of what was now my estate, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that Charles's plan had worked perfectly. Brandon was facing the consequences of his actions, and the people he had hurt were finally being heard and believed. But I also felt sad that it had taken Charles's death to make this justice possible. He had spent years hoping that Brandon would change that. Somehow the love and guidance of a father might transform a cruel young man into someone worthy of the family legacy. Instead, Brandon had proven that some people only learn through loss, and some lessons come too late to matter. His sentencing was still months away, but Brandon's privileged life was already over. He would spend his remaining years learning what it meant to be powerless, and perhaps that experience would teach him the empathy he had never developed during his years of wealth and comfort. Charles had gotten his wish. His legacy would be preserved, and his real family would use the estate to make a positive difference in the world. Justice had finally been served. 3 months after his arrest, Brandon's situation had deteriorated beyond anything he could have imagined during his years of privilege and comfort. The criminal trial had attracted national media attention, turning him into a symbol of wealthy entitlement and abuse of power. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented years of evidence showing Brandon's systematic theft from the estate accounts, his cruel treatment of staff members, and his complete disregard for the law. Video footage played in the courtroom showed Brandon threatening to have Maria deported if she reported his behavior, and audio recordings captured him bragging to friends about how he enjoyed making employees fear for their jobs. The defense attorney that Brandon could afford with his limited resources was inexperienced and overwhelmed by the evidence against his client. David Chen had withdrawn from the case when Brandon could no longer pay his fees, leaving Brandon with a court-appointed lawyer who was handling dozens of cases simultaneously. Witness after witness took the stand to describe Brandon's misconduct. Former staff members testified about years of verbal abuse and workplace harassment. Business associates described how Brandon had lied about his father's health to secure loans he had no intention of repaying. Even some of his former friends testified about his cruel behavior and his boasts about exploiting people who depended on him for employment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: embezzlement, elder abuse, witness, intimidation, and fraud. The judge sentenced Brandon to 4 years in state prison, describing his crimes as a betrayal of trust that had caused immeasurable harm to vulnerable people who had depended on his family for their livelihoods. But prison was not Brandon's only problem. His gambling debts to Tommy Delacroix had not disappeared with his arrest, and Tommy was not the type of person who accepted excuses or showed mercy to customers who could not pay. While Brandon was awaiting trial, Tommy's associates had made it clear that they expected payment regardless of his legal troubles. When Brandon was unable to settle his debts, Tommy decided to make an example of him. Word spread through the underground gambling community that Brandon Whitmore, once the heir to millions, was now a deadbeat who had welched on his obligations. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of gambling beyond one's means. Brandon's reputation in prison was established before he even arrived. Inmates had seen the news coverage of his case, and they had no sympathy for a privileged rich kid who had abused working people. He was assigned to work in the prison laundry, where he experienced the kind of treatment he had once given to others. The irony was not lost on anyone, including Brandon himself. The man who had once fired employees for minor mistakes was now subject to the arbitrary authority of prison guards and trustees who seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning him the most unpleasant tasks available. Meanwhile, I was using the Whitmore estate to honor Charles's memory in ways that Brandon never could have imagined. With Harold's legal guidance and financial advice, I established the Charles Whitmore Foundation, which provided scholarships for students from working-class families who wanted to pursue higher education. Part of the estate was converted into affordable housing for service workers, teachers, and other people whose jobs were essential but poorly paid. The remaining grounds were open to the community for events and activities that brought people together regardless of their economic circumstances. Maria was hired as the foundation's community outreach coordinator, using her bilingual skills and deep connections in the local community to identify families who could benefit from our programs. James was brought back as head groundskeeper, and together we transformed the estate gardens into educational spaces where children could learn about environmental conservation and sustainable agriculture. The media coverage of these changes was overwhelmingly positive. News stories described how the Whitmore estate had been transformed from a symbol of privilege and exclusivity into a community resource that honored the values Charles had always claimed to believe in. Several months after Brandon's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from him. Prison mail was heavily monitored and censored, but Brandon had managed to write a message that was surprisingly thoughtful and introspective. He described how the experience of being powerless had forced him to confront the pain he had caused others. He wrote about working alongside men who had been incarcerated for crimes committed out of desperation, and how their stories had helped him understand the difference between people who made mistakes because they had few options and people like himself who had chosen to do harm despite having every advantage in life. The letter included an apology that seemed genuine, though I knew that words on paper could not undo years of cruelty and abuse. Brandon wrote that he hoped to spend his remaining time in prison learning skills that would allow him to make positive contributions to society when he was eventually released. He also asked about the estate and whether the changes I had made were honoring his father's memory in the way Charles had hoped. That question surprised me because it suggested that Brandon was beginning to understand what his father had been trying to teach him all along. I decided to visit Brandon in prison, not because I had forgiven him or forgotten the harm he had caused, but because Charles had believed in the possibility of redemption, even for people who had made terrible choices. The visiting room was a stark institutional space filled with families trying to maintain connections across the barriers of incarceration. Brandon looked older than his years, his expensive suits replaced by orange prison uniforms, his arrogant demeanor replaced by something that looked like humility. Our conversation was brief but meaningful. Brandon asked about the people he had hurt, and I was able to tell him that Maria had been promoted and was thriving in her new role, that James had been reunited with his children and was building a stable life, and that other former staff members had found better positions where their skills and dedication were appreciated. He listened carefully to everything I told him, asking follow-up questions that suggested he was genuinely interested in their well-being rather than just trying to ease his own guilt. When visiting time ended, Brandon shook my hand and thanked me for giving him the opportunity to see how the estate was being used to help others. As I drove home through the countryside toward the estate that was now mine to protect and preserve, I reflected on how completely the situation had been reversed. Brandon, who had once held power over so many people's lives, was now entirely dependent on the mercy of others. I, who had once been dismissed as just a gardener, was now responsible for continuing Charles's legacy and using his wealth to make a positive difference in the world. The transformation had been painful, but necessary, and I believe that Charles would have been proud of how everything had worked out. Justice had been served, but more importantly, his values would live on through the foundation that bore his name and the community that had grown up around his estate. 2 years have passed since that day in the garden when I triggered the inheritance clause that changed everything. As I write this, I am sitting in Charles's former study, surrounded by the law books and family photographs that once seemed to belong to a different world. Now they are part of my world, and I have tried to honor the trust that Charles placed in me. The Charles Whitmore Foundation has awarded scholarships to 87 students from working-class families, helping them pursue degrees in fields ranging from nursing to engineering to education. Maria has become one of my closest friends and most trusted advisors, and her work with the foundation has touched hundreds of lives in ways that continue to surprise and inspire me. The affordable housing units we created on part of the estate grounds are home to 32 families, including several former staff members who had been struggling to find safe and affordable places to live. James has expanded the gardens to include a community farm where residents can grow their own food and learn sustainable agriculture techniques. But perhaps the most meaningful change has been the way the estate has become a gathering place for people from all walks of life. We host community events, educational workshops, and cultural celebrations that bring together people who might never have interacted during the years when the estate was a symbol of exclusivity and privilege. The media attention has been overwhelmingly positive, with several national magazines featuring stories about how inherited wealth can be used responsibly to address social problems. I have been invited to speak at conferences about philanthropy and social justice, sharing Charles's story and the lessons I learned about the difference between deserving something and earning it. Harold has become much more than my lawyer. He has become a mentor and father figure who helps me navigate the complexities of managing significant wealth and responsibility. His patient guidance has been invaluable, as I have learned to balance the desire to help others with the need to preserve resources for long-term sustainability. And yes, Harold and I have developed feelings for each other that go beyond our professional relationship. Our friendship grew into something deeper as we worked together to build the foundation and transform the estate into something that Charles would have been proud to see. We were married last spring in a simple ceremony in the estate garden, surrounded by the community that has become our extended family. Miranda has also remained in our lives, though in a very different capacity than anyone might have expected. Her work gathering evidence for Charles opened her eyes to issues of social justice and inequality, and she has become a passionate advocate for workers' rights. She now runs a nonprofit organization that helps domestic workers organize for better wages and working conditions. The transformation in Miranda's life has been almost as dramatic as my own. She went from being someone who valued wealth and status above everything else to becoming someone who uses her skills and connections to fight for people who have been marginalized and exploited. Her relationship with Harold is built on shared values and genuine affection rather than financial calculation. Brandon was released from prison 8 months ago, and his reintegration into society has been challenging but encouraging. The man who emerged from 4 years of incarceration was fundamentally different from the arrogant heir who had once treated people as disposable objects for his entertainment. Prison had stripped away Brandon's sense of entitlement and forced him to confront the real consequences of his actions. He had worked into the laundry-attended anger management classes and participated in programs designed to help inmates develop empathy and responsibility. The experience had been brutal but transformative. When Brandon was released, he had no money, no connections, and a criminal record that made employment difficult to find. But he also had something he had never possessed during his years of privilege: genuine humility and a desire to make amends for the harm he had caused. I made a decision that surprised many people, including Harold and Miranda. I offered Brandon a job with the foundation working in maintenance and groundskeeping under James's supervision. It was entry-level work that paid a modest wage, but it offered Brandon the opportunity to rebuild his life through honest labor. The decision was controversial even among people who supported the foundation's mission. Why give a second chance to someone who had caused so much pain? Why risk the foundation's reputation by associating with a convicted felon? But I remembered Charles's belief in the possibility of redemption, and I wanted to honor that belief by offering Brandon the same kind of opportunity that Charles had given to me. The difference was that Brandon would have to earn his second chance through consistent demonstration of changed behavior rather than through family connection or inherited privilege. Brandon accepted the job offer with gratitude and has worked diligently to prove himself worthy of the trust I placed in him. He arrives early, stays late, and treats everyone with the kind of respect he had never shown during his years as the heir to the Whitmore fortune. He has apologized personally to Maria, James, and other staff members he had mistreated, and those apologies seem genuine based on his subsequent actions. The work Brandon does now is exactly the kind of labor he once considered beneath his dignity. He maintains the garden's repairs equipment and helps prepare the grounds for community events. He earns a salary that requires him to live modestly and budget carefully, experiencing for the first time what life is like for people who must work to survive. But perhaps more importantly, Brandon has found purpose in contributing to something larger than himself. He takes pride in maintaining the beauty of the estate and supporting the foundation's mission. He has discovered that there is satisfaction in honest work that he never found in the empty pursuits that once filled his days. Brandon and I have developed what I would describe as a cautious friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to honoring Charles's legacy. We will never be close in the way that family members should be because too much damage was done during his years of cruelty and entitlement. But we have found a way to work together constructively, and I believe that Charles would have been proud to see his adopted son finally learning the values he had tried to teach. 6 months ago, I received a letter from one of the scholarship recipients, a young woman named Sarah, whose mother had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families her entire adult life. Sarah was the first person in her family to attend college, and she was studying to become a social worker so she could help other families navigate the systems that determine access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity. Sarah wrote that the scholarship had changed not just her life, but her family's understanding of what was possible for people like them. Her younger brothers were now planning to apply for college themselves, inspired by their sister's success and supported by the knowledge that financial barriers did not have to be insurmountable. That letter captured everything that Charles had hoped to achieve through his careful planning and his faith in the power of character to triumph over circumstance. He had used his wealth to create opportunities for people who deserved them but might never have received them, and those opportunities were creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond anything he could have imagined. As I finish writing this story, I want to share the most important lesson I learned from Charles, and from the experience of inheriting wealth I had never expected to receive. True inheritance is not about money or property or social status. True inheritance is about values, character, and the responsibility to use whatever advantages we possess to make life better for others. Charles left me financial resources, but more importantly, he left me an example of how to think beyond my own immediate needs and consider the long-term impact of my choices. He showed me that wealth carries obligations and that the measure of a person's worth is not what they accumulate, but what they contribute. Brandon learned that lesson the hard way through loss and punishment and years of struggling to rebuild his life from nothing. But he did learn it, and his transformation proves that it is never too late for people to change if they are willing to do the difficult work of examining their own behavior and accepting responsibility for the harm they have caused. I think about Charles often as I walk through the gardens where I once worked as a secret granddaughter pretending to be a hired gardener. I imagine him watching the children who now play on the grounds where Brandon once threw tantrums, and I hope he would be proud of how his estate has become a place of learning, growth, and community rather than exclusivity and privilege. The inheritance clause that seemed so dramatic and shocking when I triggered it was actually just the beginning of a longer story about justice, redemption, and the power of second chances. Charles understood that real change takes time, and that the most important transformations happen not through sudden dramatic events, but through the daily choice to treat others with dignity and respect. I have learned that being worthy of an inheritance means using it to create opportunities for others to discover their own worth. The greatest privilege is not having access to wealth, but having the chance to use that wealth to make a positive difference in the world. Charles gave me both the resources and the responsibility to carry on his legacy, and I have tried to honor that trust by remembering that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the positive changes we make possible. The boy who once screamed at me to cut the grass better has grown into a man who now tends that same grass with care and pride. The gardener who once seemed powerless has become someone with the ability to plant seeds of opportunity that will grow for generations to come. That transformation is Charles's real legacy, and it is the inheritance I hope to pass on to others. I hope this story has inspired you to think about the people in your life who might need a second chance, and the ways we can all use whatever advantages we possess to lift others up rather than keep them down. Have you ever witnessed someone in power abusing their position? How do you think our society can better protect workers and vulnerable people from exploitation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people finding the strength to stand up for what is right. Share this story with friends and family who might need to hear that character always triumphs over privilege in the end. Thank you for listening, and remember that every day offers us the chance to choose kindness over cruelty, justice over convenience, and hope over despair. May you always have the courage to do what is right, even when it seems impossible.